it's great to have both of you on here. What we're going to talk about today is just the bizarre ways that we choose to measure our economy, and specifically measure the success of our economy. So it'd be brilliant to hear your thoughts on that.
I guess the main way or the main thing that's used to measure most economies is GDP, gross domestic product. And in some respects, I'm going to speak in favor of it, first of all, because before we had GDP, or some sense that the size of an economy can be measured by what it produces, I guess before that, if you go back to sort of before Adam Smith and so on, you're looking at the success of an economy being measured by how much you can loot from your neighbors, in effect. So in some respects, measuring an economy by what it produces is probably a good thing compared with what preceded it. The modern measure of GDP was developed by a guy called Simon Kuznets in the 1930s, but he very quickly said, whatever you do, don't use this to measure the well-being of an economy. And almost immediately afterwards, he was completely ignored. So in some respects, it's kind of interesting to look at what is in GDP and what is not in GDP, because first and foremost, it's probably not even particularly an accurate measure of what it purports to show. I mean, it's supposed to demonstrate the volume or the value of economic activity in a country in a year, but there's lots of stuff which just simply isn't in there. So for example, if a country has a sizable black market, that's not going to be in there, and that will constitute a large amount of economic activity in some countries. Even in the UK, it's estimated that that's about 10% of GDP. The cannabis trade alone is supposed to be about 2.5 billion. So if that could be taxed, I suspect that would be a fairly sizable source of tax income. But again, another sort of big body blow to GDP is how it treats sort of environmental resources. Because if just to give one example, if you looked at sort of some river pollution, where I was growing up, I grew up in a sort of small town just north of Manchester, and there was a river at the back of near where we lived that occasionally ran sort of running with foam, and not because the water was particularly sort of choppy. It was basically stuff which had been released from a local chemical factory. Now, GDP would include all the economic activity of that factory without any allowance for the fact the river's been polluted, but it would also, let's say someone did subsequently sort of clean up that river, that would also be included in GDP. So I mean, that's a sort of slightly sort of odd and perverse sort of measure from that point of view. Another good example of something which might not be in there, and this is a big deal for particularly many developing countries, is sort of subsistence agriculture. If you produce just to feed yourself, because it never reaches at any market, that will not be included in a GDP figure. So on a smaller scale, let's say yourself, William, or Kairin, you've got an allotment. Has either of you got an allotment? No? But
not many allotments in Barcelona.
All right, okay.
Which is where I am. Kairin's probably more in Aberdeen, I reckon.
There's some down the road, yeah.
But if you did, and you produced all this wonderful produce and consumed it yourself, and it's also probably given you an enormous amount of well-being in the production of it, it won't be included in GDP. Similarly, let's imagine, for the sake of argument, I know it's a dream of Gav's to run his own cafe, a sort of slow food cafe at some point in the future, when teaching has exhausted him completely. But let's say he's run a good 60-hour week in his cafe, and he decides to sort of take the evening off to go out for dinner with his lovely wife. At that point, GDP would actually go down, whereas Gavin's well-being would probably go up. So there's lots of sort of perverse inclusions and exclusions in GDP. Do you want to add anything to that, Gav?
No, I thought that was very good.
The other important thing that doesn't get included is care work.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, unpaid care work, people who might have elderly or disabled relatives living with them, none of that would be included in GDP. There's a really good Bobby Kennedy speech on YouTube, sort of, as part of his presidential campaign, where he talks, even back then in the late 60s, about the sort of poverty of GDP as a measure of a nation's well-being. I'd really recommend that to anyone.
I think it's 1968. He made that speech, and it's absolutely wonderful. And you're reading and thinking, is this really someone who's trying to be the American president? It's very powerful, that speech. We'll put a link in the comments to it. That's really helpful when we're thinking about this idea of GDP. Now, famously, there was a heckler in Newcastle before the Brexit referendum, and they were heckling an economist, and they shouted out, "That's your bloody GDP, not ours." And I imagine we could speak for another 20 minutes on GDP without summing up as well as that. I think it was a lady who shouted that out. But can you explain why someone would think that the GDP was completely separate from them, and what does this point to in terms of inequality?
So in a sense, I guess what they might be driving at is, even though the economy has grown, because it's always about growth with GDP, you know, has the economy grown? Is the pie bigger, if you like, from one year to the next? But it would be very, you know, if you looked at the northeast of England, for example, certainly since 2007, just before the financial crisis, it's probably, and it's hard to sort of estimate the impacts of COVID subsequent to that, but it's probably just about crept back up to, you know, pre-2007 levels, the northeast economy. And yet, but the pie overall has got bigger, you know, GDP is bigger. But there's people in, you know, large sort of swathes of the country and sort of, you know, the different devolved sort of areas of the country which haven't really seen any of that growth, or certainly not in terms of their wages. You know, real wages have been stagnant, and the proportion of the pie, if you like, which has gone to the very wealthy in the UK has only increased sort of during that period. So you could see why it's almost like, you know, that's your bloody pie, as it were. We're not getting any of it. So big deal if it goes down, and you can see that in the Brexit vote, in my view. You know, that, you know, everyone's talking about the economic doom and gloom, but people in certain parts of the country say, well, it's not great for us anyway, thank you very much. And a bit sort of, what relevance is that to me? So I guess that's what I would take from it.
That's what I think was at the heart of that comment was, well, we're not seeing any of this growth. And again, GDP talks about the nation, and there's this idea that if you divide the 60 odd million people in this country into GDP, then you all get your amount. And I think that's what it tries to portray, but actually that's clearly not true. And that GDP, even if it grows or shrinks, there's still people who are doing considerably better than others in the economy. And there's no way of measuring that within that GDP or GNP figure.
No, I mean, they do try to sort of, I mean, if you looked in very raw terms, of course, you know, China's GDP or GNP, whatever measure of national income you use, would be, you know, many times bigger than the UK's. But so obviously there is the division to give it GDP per capita, but that still doesn't account for the distribution of the pie, if you like. It could be that one person is eating 2/3 of this massive pie and the rest of us have got a tiny little sliver each. And certainly, you know, inequality has grown sort of quite significantly in the last sort of 10 to 20 years. I say it's grown significantly. I mean, if you take a much longer sort of historical perspective, you know, the 19th century was awful for inequality, you know, much worse than, you know, the 20th century. But it's definitely crept up in the last 20 years. And I think that's left a lot of people feeling sort of left behind. And that's, I guess, my view on the Brexit vote, if that's not sort of too patronising for the people who did vote for Brexit. Scotland as well, you know, I think their you know, growth has gone up a bit beyond 2007, but nothing like the growth of London, for example.
I was going to say, post-COVID as well, you can see there was all this kind of discussion about how the recovery was going to happen. Was it going to be a V-shaped recovery and things like that? And then suddenly from nowhere, you know, the K recovery came from, you know, and what's the K recovery? It's the rich recovering very fast and the poor still slumping. And I mean, that kind of basically tells us everything, you know, about where we are at this current moment in time.
Yeah. And the UK economy is designed to do that. We can't be surprised that the returns are going to capital and not to labour, because that's the way that the UK economy is structured. So I think the idea of a V for everyone was unlikely to happen. And I love that image of the K recovery. I think that works really well. Yeah. We spoke a little bit about inequality, and within an economy, there's something that we use to measure inequality. I'd like you guys, if you could just to talk a little bit about that. It's the Gini coefficient, and also maybe talk about the kind of pros and cons in the way that you did in GDP.
This is Pete's bag as well. Brilliant.
You're going to bloody say something. Yeah, all right. So the Gini coefficient is actually one of a number of sort of measures of inequality. There are others like the sort of Palmer ratio and so on, but Gini is probably the most commonly used. For years, I thought it's some kind of acronym, GINI, but it is actually developed by an Italian economist called Corrado Geni. It's also, you can also represent a Gini sort of coefficient in a curve, the Lorenz curve. And if you imagine like a rectangle with a line going up from sort of left to right, sort of bisecting the rectangle, you then draw a sort of curved line. That line is what's called the line of perfect equality. So let's say, going back to my analogy of a pie, if everyone had an equally sized slice of the pie, then you would have a Gini coefficient of 0, and you would be sitting on that line of equality. If you've got any inequality whatsoever in an economy, then you would see a little sort of, a bit like a bow in a bow and arrow, you know, beneath that line of equality. And then the more bowed, if you like, that curve, the more unequal the country. And the Gini coefficient is a ratio between two areas in that sort of Lorenz curve. But in very, very simple terms, the closer the figure is to 0, the more equal the society. The closer it is to 1, the less equal the society. So it can be reduced to either a decimal fraction or a percentage. And it's quite useful in terms of being able to compare different economies, but also the same economy over time as well. And going back to what I was saying about, you know, the 19th century, like the sort of era of some of the, you know, the great economists like Marx and Ricardo and so on, you would have been looking at Gini coefficients of much higher rates than now currently. I think the UK's is about 0.33, something like that. A country like some developing countries like South Africa, Brazil, they would have much higher rates of inequality than we do. I mean, the developed world generally would have lower rates of income inequality, but within that, there would be some quite considerable variation. So Scandinavian countries would tend to have much lower Gini coefficients, and somewhere like the US would have a higher Gini coefficient, still lower than those developing countries I mentioned, but definitely more unequal. And I suppose what is also interesting is to look at the trends there, which are definitely moving towards, you know, not quite 19th century levels, but certainly the highest rates, you know, for quite some time. And secondly, one thing that isn't often discussed is wealth inequality, which is, you know, we always talk about this. And I think even on some websites I was looking at, when you talk about GDP, there's often confusion between wealth and income. You know, wealth is what you own, income is what you earn. And in some respects, there's even greater levels of inequality in the UK with respect to wealth and with respect to income. And obviously from wealth, you can derive an income as well. And that, in some respects, I would argue is a much greater problem, or, you know, it is at least as great a problem, and something which really I don't think any political party has got a plan for. You know, how are we going to deal with wealth inequality? You know, there's been talk of sort of mansion taxes and things like that, but there's nothing really come close to any form of, you know, actual policy on the ground. Yeah.
Similarly, the UK economy is designed to do that, with the amount of privatisation that has taken place over the last 40 years, and the shifting from the relative wealth of the commons to privatising individual wealth. So I think that wealth inequality is baked in to the UK, and with Scottish independence, we hope that we're able to look at that in a slightly different way. You know, we spoke about the Gini coefficient, and there's certainly an idea that it's kind of doing the rounds, which I would say this idea of measuring happiness. And people often actually misquote and say that New Zealand is now using that as their official measurement, and that's not actually true. New Zealand use GDP like everyone else as their official measurement, but they are open and talking about this idea of measuring the happiness. Have you guys got any thoughts on that as a way to measure an economy?
Well, I mean, in 2010, David Cameron said he was going to start measuring kind of happiness in terms of well-being. So you can, if you want to, go onto the ONS website and check out what the latest data is on well-being. They don't publish it that much, I think, especially at the moment, because it's all going down. But I mean, that's kind of what they're trying to do. But a lot of the time it's based on kind of surveys, isn't it, in terms of like, how do you feel today? And, how did you feel last week or whatever. So it's kind of quite tricky sometimes to measure that. And from a behavioral kind of economics point of view, we kind of appreciate the fact that if you've had suddenly something nice happens to you on that day, you're like, yeah, I'm really happy. And you don't kind of reflect on the broader aspects of it. But I mean, it's obviously a good idea because, there's this kind of idea that was brought up by Richard Eastlin, the Eastlin paradox, which is, this idea that when you earn a certain amount of income, you kind of happiness plateaus, and so therefore, and I think this has happened since about the 70s in the UK. So we're getting richer and richer apparently, but we're not getting any kind of happier. So therefore, if we've got that disconnect, we need to start thinking about how we can go around kind of changing that, and maybe redistribution is kind of one way of going around doing it, or just reconnecting, the idea of having maybe a 4-day working week so you could spend more time with your family, or universal basic income, maybe it's something that makes you feel like you can do your hobbies a bit more, or write poetry, whatever you want to do to bring about your kind of happiness. But I mean, it is something that obviously they've tried to do, and there is kind of other indexes that have tried to bring that into account. So one of the ones that we kind of look at school is the Happy Planet Index, which was put together by the New Economics Foundation, which kind of wanted to include that, as well as including kind of a carbon footprint and things like that, and Costa Rica at the top of it. So it is quite interesting to see that the world is kind of changing a bit and kind of accepting that. And obviously we know about Bhutan as well, who kind of have that as a singular focus to thinking about the well-being of their population.
I mean, just to go back, I think what you said about New Zealand, I do think they had some sort of thing in their fiscal policy whereby when budgetary items were put forward, they had to sort of, debate or discuss what impact it would have on well-being rather than what impact would it have on growth. So even though I think GDP is the measure, it was like almost in the systems of how fiscal policy was conducted. I think they worked in there there had to be some consideration of well-being. I think two key thinkers which your listeners might want to look out for, Professor Richard Layard has done a lot of work on sort of different indicators which could be used to, and I think he influenced the stuff which is on the ONS website, didn't he? So that's one to look out for, I think. The Eastlin paradox is really interesting as well, because apparently some of one's happiness is derived from where you are in the pecking order in your country, which is slightly depressing. So even if the whole country isn't necessarily getting much richer, as long as you're okay relative to other people, apparently that improves one's well-being, which isn't the most gratifying of messages. But it is interesting because you kind of think we do pile on GDP with incomes. If you think about even from when I was a kid, the level of material wealth that even the average person enjoys is infinitely better than for most people, I think. But are people any happier? And the whole business of saying, oh, it's all about questionnaires and so on, I do take that, but just because something's difficult to measure doesn't mean that we should ignore it, because in a sense GDP is easy to measure, relatively speaking, and all the things we talked about, like including environmental degradation, is really hard. It's really hard to measure it, but just because something's hard to measure, it doesn't make it any less important. And so why sort of use a target which is easy to measure, even though we don't value it, rather than something which is hard to measure, which we do actually value. So in some respects, you kind of think, well, maybe more work should go into in these sort of measures, a bit more objective or more accepted. They'll probably never be completely sort of objective, but if you had a kind of like citizens' assembly which said, okay, this is what as a country we think constitutes, a meaningful life, then, a flourishing life, then, then we could look to develop some kind of metrics to measure that. It's kind of what Amrita Sen was trying to do, actually, to be fair.
Can I just interject there as well and bring up the point about making the comparison between yourself and other people? I mean, my background is anatomical sciences, so I'm interested in health. And Michael Marmot did quite a lot of research on this. And of course, you'll probably know about the spirit level. It's Kate Pickett and Richard Williamson that wrote that. And they did about 10 years of research before they published that book. And it's very clear from their separate research that feeling of you being not doing so well as the people round about you is very toxic on a societal level.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really good book, actually, that Spirit Level book. We recommended that.
It is a good book. And the band James summed it up in their song Come Home. If you haven't seen such riches, you can live with being poor. So there is a book, and there's also a song by James that you can look at. I think that's really, really important. And that relative wealth or relative poverty, I think is really, really important.
On that note, I mean, even that's about money just generally. We're obviously seeing students all the time who feel that about their gradings. So even when students get a really good grade, if it's not a 9, they are under so much pressure, and it's just sometimes a miserable environment to be in, because you kind of that is our life now. If you're not getting a 9, you're nothing, and that's obviously kind of related to this thing about income. If everyone wants to be Instagram famous and have lots of money, because that is where the value comes from nowadays, and that's such a sad place to be at.
And 9 is the top grade you can get in GCSEs, which is what our 16-year-olds do.
I would love to ask another question about your students, because what we are often told is that the younger generation are less materialistic, and that they're much more interested in experiences, and they're less interested in material things, which would obviously completely change the way that we measure our economy and also structure our economy. As two teachers who deal with this generation every day, is there any truth to that?
I'd say it's a pretty mixed picture, I would say. A lot of our kids, I think they choose economics partly because they, the kids we particularly spend a lot of time with, because they see it, probably wrongly actually, as a sort of passport to sort of achieving material success. It's a very boy-dominated subject, and a lot of boys will think this is my passport to working in the city. Once they hear me and Gav sort of boring on about, oh no, it's actually about resource allocation, they sort of, you can see them sort of, oh no, I'm not going to make my millions playing the stock market after 2 years of economics. But I'm eternally optimistic about young people, and I do think, generally, I think that they are positive about the future. I think they do value sort of friendships and things like that. They're much more liberal, I think, on a sort of social basis than often people of sort of my generation would be. Incredibly liberal about all manner of sort of social issues, which I think still, people of older generations struggle with. But whether they're sort of less materialistic, not sure about that. But maybe that's where we are in the southeast of England, which is sort of where all this wealth is being generated and all this GDP is being created, and at the exclusion of everyone else, in all honesty.
And the level of wealth that you see, because I lived in London for 8 years, the level of wealth for me when I moved down there in my early 20s was astounding. I mean, for me, it was astounding. And if you're living around that all the time, that is going to be very much a case of, oh my God, I'm nowhere close to that.
But everyone in London feels poor. Most people do, despite them being on astonishing incomes. And you have to sort of, there's a famous sort of question time. There's one guy who's just like, there's a Labour MP on, and he was basically saying that some guy in the audience is saying, I earn 80 grand and that makes me sort of really this and this guy's, no, that makes you sort of in the top sort of 5% of the country.
Yeah.
I was getting red in the face saying, no, that's not true. And he's thinking, and the MP was going, no, it really is true.
I'd like to call out Labour as liars. I am one of them people that he will tax more, and I am nowhere near in the top 5%. So I'm calling you a liar right now. That 5% is a lie.
So hang on, let's just be clear. So you're suggesting you would raise income tax on those earning over £80,000. You're saying that would affect you because you earn over that sum?
Yes.
So you earn over £8,000?
Yes, and I'm not in the top 5%.
I think that is the top 5%, isn't it?
I'm not.
But you can see how that kind of perception can develop if everyone around you is absolutely, or enough people are to make you think, oh, I'm here, but they're up there, and I think that is the case in certainly in parts of London.
When we're looking at all the ways of measuring the economy, I kind of wanted to break it down into the simplest form possible, which was it seemed to be that we measure to see if we've grown the economy, and if there's growth, that's good, and if there's not growth, that's bad. That seems to be the kind of most simplest way that we're measuring our economy. Would you agree? And would you have any kind of issues with that as the base of us measuring the success of our economy and our well-being?
It's definitely what we do, without question. I mean, you got all these talking heads, everyone. I think it's probably across all political parties, perhaps with the honourable exception of the Green Party in sort of England, who might say, well, what's the point in this? But absolutely, and you've got to remember what is growing. What is growing is the amount of goods and services produced in a country from one year compared with the next year. It's a measure of income. It's not a measure of wealth. So, in a sense, it doesn't, and it's certainly not a measure of sort of that flourishing of humanity, which you would want it to be.
Kate Raworth's book, I mean, there's a chapter which is all about being agnostic about growth. So if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Again, it depends on obviously what you're doing with regards to resources within your country. And I thought that was an excellent chapter. And pretty much with that.
I think that agnosticism about growth, it's almost like, well, let's take it back a step. What kind of lives do we want people to have? And if growth occurs when we're trying to enable them to achieve those lives, then great. But if it doesn't, who cares? Because they're achieving the lives that they want to achieve. And that's very much the project of Amartya Sen, who we did one of our episodes on it. This idea that economic development should be about human flourishing, if you like. He talked about sort of capabilities. If it allows you to do certain things, the development in that country, then that's great. But if it doesn't, it's almost a bit pointless. Yeah, I mean, his book, Development as Freedom, it's not the easiest book in the world to read, but the actual burden of his argument is really, really powerful. So again, I'd recommend that. So it's really good. And that actually, he was behind this. Well, I say he was behind it. It was actually put into practice by another economist, Mahbub Haq. The Human Development Index, which is a slightly broader measure of, I mean, Sen, the guy I was talking about, still, I think, you get the impression thinks that in itself was a bit limited, but I think he felt that at least it's broadening the debate beyond simply GDP. Is it bigger? Is it not bigger? So the Human Development Index would include GDP per head, but also mean and average years of schooling. So it's almost like a three-pillared approach. There's a pillar about education, a pillar about life expectancy, and a pillar which is sort of GDP per capita, which would, I guess, be a proxy for income. And those three things form an index. And again, every country in the world, if you like, gets a number in that sort of relatively simple index. So it's trying to broaden, at least it might not be a perfect measure again, but at least it broadens it beyond simply sort of GDP. So you get this sense that actually GDP in itself is a bit worthless, but if it allows people to live longer lives, which are perhaps more interesting because of the education they've had and the opportunities that brings, then that's probably a better measure, if you like.
Yeah, and just building on that as well, I mean, there's also an inequality adjusted HDI. So, they've tried to deal with that issue as well. And I've just mentioned Jason Hickel, and he's now come up with this thing called the Sustainable Development Index, which is basically HDI divided by, I think it's called your kind of eco overshoot, you know, so where your country is basically, you know, wasted too much resources or whatever, it kind of takes that away from the HDI. So again, there's all this kind of meddling going on at the moment to try and get a better picture and overview of our countries, you know.
The other measurement I wanted to ask you about as well was the genuine progress indicator.
Yeah.
Do either of you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it was created in 1995 by a US-based organisation. And it has, I think it says 26 indicators, again, covering social, environmental, and, you know, human conditions. So there's lots of things in it, crime, you know, volunteering. So some of the things that we've spoken about are included in that genuine progress indicator. So it's interesting. One of the things that I do in my lessons when we teach economic growth is trying to get students to come up with their own, you know, say, well, how would you measure, you know, a country? You know, would you just stick with GDP or what would you do? And so you send them off in their little groups and they do their presentations. And it's always interesting to come back and they've all got different things, because obviously for different people, different things matter. And the question that you always ask as a teacher, for example, crimes included in that GPI, you'd say, what crime were you measuring? Okay, so you're then trying to get down to the bones of the data. And then, obviously, this is one of the issues about the GPI, is it all being recorded in the same way across X amount of countries? So when you're then trying to compare countries, I'm not saying it's worthless, because obviously, again, you want to have this, you know, information, and it is quite interesting. But it's so difficult to, 26 indicators, trying to get that across, I don't know, 160, 180 countries. It's just a massive ask. And sometimes the simplicity kind of, you know, is better. But obviously it's important to get that somewhere in the debate that we're having.
Yeah, it's interesting you're saying about, obviously that is the big advantage in theory of GDP. It is simple, people get it, you know, it's the pie bigger 1 year to the next. But when you actually dig into GDP, it does have all manner of flaws. Even GDP, is it internationally comparable? In theory it is, but, you know, one country's got an enormous sort of informal economy and another one doesn't. You've got to do all kinds of shenanigans with, you know, like adjust it for purchasing power parity and things like that. So
in Scotland, every year we have something called GERS. Just wondered if either of you have come across GERS as a measurement for the Scottish economy, and if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I have to admit, not until this morning. and to be honest, reading about it, it is genuinely fascinating. I was seeing that it was set up by John Major in 1992, and it was kind of done at a time when there was low oil prices. So it was kind of organised and set up to portray Scotland in a really bad light. It's fascinating. And then there's that bit in there where it doesn't get published for a year because they're changing the methodology of it all. And so it is fascinating. And taking Richard Murphy's kind of thing where he says, was it on the GERS homepage, the primary objective is to estimate a set of public sector accounts of Scotland through detailed analysis of official UK and Scottish government financial statistics, just estimates, you know, so it's all estimations and, you know, well, that's guesstimates, isn't it, ultimately, you know, and there's a great bit in one of his articles that he wrote about how Westminster can manipulate data at will. Now, that was done, I think he wrote that 3 years ago, the article. And now we've got a man who has absolutely no qualms at all manipulating any data whatsoever. So, it was. Thank you for putting us onto it in many respects, because it is.
No, I didn't know it existed, but it is really interesting.
It's amazing to read about.
Yeah, one thing that I found really interesting is like, we put in a value for an estimate of, you know, Scotland's contribution to the national debt, and you think, you know, how do you do that? You know, that must be an incredibly arbitrary sort of decision. And B, surely if there was Scottish independence, that would be a major political rather than economic debate, I would think.
For me, coming from a science background, from an actual science background, you'd look at, to me, I look at the report and I go, Yeah, that's just complete nonsense. You've made a comparison between a country which creates its own currency and a country that doesn't. And you can't, for a start, make a comparison of those two things on a scientific level. It's complete nonsense to try.
No,
Yeah.
but there's all kinds of things. You can't just carve up a bit of an economy and, you know, easily say, well, this bit of the economy generated that bit of income. I think it's quite hard to do for a nation state, let alone sort of, you know, a country which currently doesn't have its own sort of, you know, independent fiscal policy and currency, as you said. But so yeah, I think it was interesting though. One, I didn't know it existed, but one, the more I read about it, I was thinking, oh, blimey, you know. I think it's just one of the more extreme cases of how, you know, statistics can be sort of manipulated.
As you said, it looks like it's been designed to show a particular view of the Scottish economy. But what's really interesting for us here in Scotland is that it's produced by the Scottish Government, and there's no alternative to this. And every GERS day, which I know you'll be searching the hashtag now, it's the end of August. You'll see it dominates the headlines in Scotland in the lead up to, and the day and after. And if you go on, these figures are banded right across our predominantly unionist supporting media. So it has a huge impact. And as Richard Murphy has says, it's based on nothing but bad guesses. But because it says the narrative that the Conservative government, the establishment, and the unionist supporting press say, it gets a huge amount of coverage. And that just one. And when I see that, I think, but are a lot of other measurements of the economy the same? And, you know, and that led me to this side. You know, what is it that GDP actually says, and who's deciding on the types of things that we measure?
It's true what you say, though. Question every bit of data. There's no doubt about it. Whenever you look, I mean, even something like microloans, which we've just recently looked at, you know, you can make a case on whatever piece of data that you choose. You know, this is the thing, is that the manipulation of data is just quite fascinating. So that's economics.
Well, I was very lucky to have a good economics teacher in my secondary school. And I think it's been clear from us today that your students are really lucky to have you as teachers been able to paint the picture of economics so well for us. Before you go, I just want to, Kairin will probably laugh, but now that I've brought you into the world of GERS, I would love to send you a link to the Sustainable Growth Commission report for you to look at, because that's another gem of economic analysis of the Scottish economy, which you might find quite amusing. Brilliant, Pete and Gav, thanks so much for joining us. I feel really lucky to have had you spending this time with us today.
Yeah,
we really enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you very much. We really enjoyed it. Thank you. Nice to meet you both.
Thanks so much. Bye now.
Bye.
That was great.
It was really good, wasn't it? With a brilliant interaction on the chat as well. Thanks very much, everyone. Loads and loads of comments still coming in. Let us know what you think of two English economics teachers' responses to GERS. I think that's really interesting that they picked this up without any, as Richard Murphy often says, without any particular dog in the fight. They can still see that there's something wrong with that. Kairin, I just wonder, what did you pick up from that interview? Was there any kind of things that you really caught your eye when they were talking through this craziness of measuring the economy?
Yeah, well, I think there was so much in this episode, actually. I learned so much from them. And I think it's very clear that GDP is very limited. I would imagine if you were in charge of the economy of a country, that you would surely look at several different metrics to try and gauge where you are and where you need to be going. But what was interesting was Pete saying initially that GDP doesn't really work. And it certainly doesn't measure the black economy. And for example, he said that would be about 10% of GDP, really, realistically, and that the cannabis trade alone would be something like worth 2.5 billion. And then the other thing that was really poignant for me was that pollution increases GDP. So, I'm involved with this case against the British government that they are supporting polluters through really through a taxation regime which is supine to them. And
You just know that something's wrong, don't you? It's so clear that something's wrong with GDP when it treats disasters, ecological disasters, as an uptick in the benefit for the economy. It's kind of like that is the thing that shows you that there's something inherently wrong with the way that we're measuring it.
yeah, it's yeah, I'm interested in other metrics, of course, for that reason, because that seems crazy to me. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was the Happy Planet Index that Gav brought up. I thought that was really interesting. I checked that out later. That's a really interesting website. The other interesting thing that they brought up as well was that their classes are very masculine. A lot of boys take their classes, and that they suspected that they were doing it because they thought it would be the path to wealth in later life. And that's quite an interesting thing. The other thing that I thought was really interesting that they brought up as well, with that in mind, was that the kids still feel that the that thing of keeping up with the Joneses, even when you're a child. And that was really interesting as well, and concerning. And the last thing that I thought was really important was the manipulation of data, and that we all have to be looking for multiple sources when you get a bit of information. Don't just take that first bit of information. Go and find a second, or even better, a third or fourth thing that's going to give you a clearer picture of what that's trying to say, that what that data is trying to say, or what that person is trying to say with that data. Because obviously their life experiences are going to cloud how they interpret it, and you want to look at a variety of people's experiences going into their interpretation of data.
Yeah, that's what I picked up, and I was actually thinking about if that's the case with individuals, what role does the media have? Because we so often see these stories that are built around normally one bit of data, and you'll see increasingly that the people who are writing the stories are not interpreting that data or building out from it. They're just regurgitating it, and I think it's really, really important that we do that, and also look to see who's putting that data out, because that tends to tell you, give you a good indication of what that data is likely to say. So I thought it was a fascinating way to end, and we've got a brilliant comment from Scallyfant here about GERS, which says, I love how their reaction was basically WTF. And that was it, wasn't it? They were like, are you serious? Why have I never heard of this before? So it was a really good example, I think, to finish on. It'd be great if anyone just wants to drop in the chat what they picked up, what they're going to take away from what I think was a really, really, really interesting episode. What are we up to next? We've got a couple of weeks until the next Scotonomics. What are we covering here?
Well, we've got food sovereignty coming up, and this was something that we decided to do, William, wasn't it? Because the first episode brought up, quite a lot of feeling about food sovereignty. So we're hoping that we can shed some light on food sovereignty in Scotland and where we are with that, with this week that's coming up about food sovereignty on Indie Live. So I hope everyone can join in. Please, 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 can I ask people, share our shows on social media, share it on your Facebook page, share it on Twitter, share it on LinkedIn. Whatever social media you're using, please keep sharing. The more we share, the more we'll be connected with other people who are interested in this.
Yeah, it does help for sure. Yeah, I'm looking forward. The next couple of weeks, we've got a whole week of stuff around food sovereignty and food security. So it's going to be really good to be able to get into the economics of it on our next show. But until then, I'm sure you've got loads of things on, Kairin, with everything. I expect to see you on maybe the back page of the National next week rather than the front page, the way that you're going. Good luck with everything that you're doing, and we'll speak to each other soon. And for everyone watching, thanks so much for joining us, and as Kairin very politely asked, please do share and like this so we can get it out to more people. Thanks so much for joining us. Until next time, bye for now.
Bye bye.